The way we're going to run this is I'm going to ask each individual to introduce themselves, to talk a little bit about who they are, what they do. Christos, I think everybody knows you at this point.
Yeah, so I haven't really changed the last couple of hours, so I'm the same person. I'm working out of our office in San Francisco with the Orange, so being
perfect.
Mr. Scientist there.
Nick.
I'm Nick Lippis, and I'm a co-founder and also a co-chair of the Open Networking User Group, which is a user group that is primarily on the East Coast right now, and we're very fortunate to have most of our board members are members of the large financial services, so like JP Morgan, UBS, Credit Suisse, let's see, Citigroup, as well as Sears, The Gap, FedEx, Equinox, and so forth. So we run a large user group that's focused around open networking and open infrastructure.
Great. Dan?
Well, good morning. My name is Dan Pitt. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Networking Foundation. We are approaching our 3rd anniversary next month. We are dedicated to the acceleration of the adoption of Open SDN. We formed really out of the work that came from Stanford University. We built out what we call the OpenFlow substrate. We standardized the OpenFlow protocol. We have built lots of hooks and tools to the orchestration and software layers above the OpenFlow substrate, and also new technologies underneath it that it applies to. So we've been a supporter of the open movement in general. This is one component of it, and I'm excited to be here today.
Great, thank you. Guru.
Hi, I'm Guru Parulkar. Good morning. I serve as the Executive Director of Open Networking Research Center at Stanford University, also Executive Director of Open Networking Lab, which is an independent non-profit organization, and I also run something called Open Networking Summit. So as you probably know, SDN started at Stanford, so we have been involved in SDN from very beginning. Our motivation has always been to enable innovation, help network operators build their infrastructure with better CapEx, better OpEx, be able to bring new services. And in support of that, we are still working to make that happen. We still have long ways to go, but that has been, we have been after for all these years.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So let me share a little bit with you about why I asked these 4 gentlemen to join us here. As I began in my keynote, I talked about how we all have a shared common vision that something needs to change within the network. And that's shared in our community certainly by the developers, but also it comes from a groundswell of feelings that we have heard from end users. And so each of these individuals is representing a group of users. And so I wanted to start by addressing a question to you, Nick. As you run the Open Networking User Group, I imagine that you have a lot of different users across a lot of different industries talk to you about the challenges of running a network. And so I would love to hear you, if you can be, to use a French term, the porte-parole, if you can give voice to the end user sentiments about what's wrong with networking the way it is now.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks, Neela. Yeah, I think the thing that I often hear is that networking, the marketplace is looking for CapEx and OpEx relief. And let me maybe put that into context. We know that like in the hyperscale companies, you might have one engineer that manages 10,000 servers. In enterprise networking, one network engineer may manage, how many would you guess? How many networking devices? Go ahead, you can guess.
60.
50.
60, 50. It's about 120, so it's not that bad. So it's orders of magnitude worse. So there is a huge bloat in terms of the operational cost and expense to manage corporate networks. And now you layer on top of that the 2 major new trends in computing, both mobile and cloud computing, which are now being forced to contort themselves to a 25-year-old network infrastructure. That also adds a lot of complexity and a lack of flexibility. Then you layer on top of that big data that's trying to be pulled out of the network, as well as the Internet of Things, which allegedly we're going to go from like billions to trillions of devices. And so without a new operational model to how we build and manage networks, it's just not going to happen. Or it's just going to be the operational cost is just going to run itself into limiting what they might be able to do. So I think that's what we often hear a lot. And the answer really comes down to a lot of automation around configuration and being able to drive things down from the application.
Well, we'll get to the solution in a second. Sure, Dan, did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, just briefly. We have several dozen major service providers, telecom service providers, and major enterprises that are members of and active in ONF. And in addition to the CapEx and OpEx savings that Nick mentioned, they've also come to us because they want to increase the velocity by which they can create and add new services to be competitive as their businesses change from being bit carriers to software and service providers. Part of it is motivated by the desire to compete with some of the over-the-tops. But for a long time, they've felt that they can conceive new services, but they can't implement them very fast, and especially without the cooperation of the vendors who kind of hold the purse strings, and in particular, without being able to be unique in them. Because if they go to a vendor and say, I want to add this service, the vendor says, well, maybe yes, maybe no, but if it's yes, it takes 2 years. And then all of the service providers' competitors get to use the feature as well. So it's service introduction that motivates a lot of our members also.
Perfect. So with that, unless Christos, you feel like adding to what you've already said.
Yeah, so we have a different set of challenges actually, looking from the operational side of things. So for us as a service provider, we have to deal with lots of heterogeneous networks in our infrastructure today, lots of legacy equipment. As I mentioned before, technology ages as like dogs, right? They age pretty fast, and how you essentially deal with that situation. And the other thing that is, I cannot move resources around as I need those. So for instance, if there's like a traffic spike somewhere in my network, an unforeseen situation, I want to move dynamically resources and deal with that situation. It's very hard to do it today. So how I can better innovate and essentially, throw resources where I need them, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for us.
That makes sense. Now I'd like to address a question towards you, Guru.
Sure.
So we've talked a little bit about the problem, and I think they've echoed a lot of things that we've been hearing all morning. Now, I know a bunch of folks at Stanford have been thinking for the last 10, 15 years about what an ideal solution would be. How might we do things completely differently than we do it now? So I thought maybe you could share a little bit about your thoughts on the matter.
Because I guess there is a technical aspect to the solution and there is the industry structure aspect of this solution. So let me talk about both quickly. So when it comes to the technical aspect of the solution, as we have been pushing SDN, the idea is if you can decouple the control plane and data plane and have well-defined interfaces between the control plane and data plane. So that is kind of an important aspect of the technical solution. And in the control plane, if you can somehow create the logical centralization, create good APIs, so provide interfaces through which anyone can build new and interesting services, and they don't have to be dependent on the proprietary vendor to be able to build new services. So that is kind of the SDN in nutshell, and that is what the technical part of the solution is. But I think there is the industry part of the solution, and if you listen to all these people who talked about the problem with the current networking, the problem is there is a too much dependency between people who operate the network on the vendors. In the in 90s and 2000, maybe because network operators were under pressure, they have outsourced more and more to the vendors, and as a result, now they find themselves in a situation that they are too dependent on the vendors. And now they're realizing that as a network operator, I'm so dependent on the vendors that I don't control my own destiny. I cannot decide which equipment to buy, how to build my own infrastructure, how to customize it. And so now there is this pendulum is swinging back where the network operators are waking up and saying, I am tired of doing it this way. I want a new way of doing things, so I am in more control of my destiny. And that is again SDN or this way of thinking is enabling that, because if you go from vertically integrated, being too dependent on vendors, to this horizontalization, then you can mix and match, you can combine commodity-based or whatever merchant silicon-based boxes with open source and all of that. So this is kind of the other part of the solution that is important as well.
Right. Yeah, I mentioned in my keynote earlier that there are differing opinions as to how SDN is going to come out, and I think that you expressed certainly one very clear view, cogent view, almost extreme separation of the data plane and the control plane. I'd be curious, Christos, to bring that question to you as you look at carriers. how do carriers think about adopting SDN? Are there these same debates within the pure carrier community as we're hearing sort of within our own community?
So for us, we're looking at a different, essentially, applications of SDN, whether it's like virtualizing your network and being able to instantiate and set up like virtual networks. We have a unit called Orange Business Services and looking at network as a service, for instance. So SDN can play a big role there. But also looking into other things and how we can actually bring intelligence into the network. How I can, apply policies in a more efficient way. As I alluded in my talk earlier today, we're looking into how you can actually bring in software-based solutions when you start visualizing network functions. So, for instance, like we looking into smart traffic offloading, using OpenFlow essentially to do some traffic steering in the network. So it's gonna vary a lot. So depending on what your pain points are in your network, where you're bleeding more, I think that's where you might find the better applications. And I do mention the traffic offloading because we start looking at the wireless and mobile space, and I think that might be a sweet spot for SDN essentially. But it will take time to reach that point because migration is a very slow path, right? And so maybe if we identify those areas in the network where you can actually bring change. And that hopefully that change will ripple across your infrastructure.
Great. Nick, let me address a question towards you. So here we've heard sort of two different voices from, here we heard from the carrier perspective. I know you also work with a lot of financials, a lot of data center side. What are you hearing from them around the solution? Are you seeing people saying OpenFlow is going to solve all of our issues, or are there questions around needing to have multiple protocols, for example? Can you share your perspective there?
Yeah, I think there is a dichotomy, I think, that's occurring in the industry, where OpenFlow is really being very well affected and implemented in service providers and in carriers. Mm-hmm. For example, like PACnet and what they're doing with Velo. I'm just amazed by that particular case study. In the enterprise marketplace, though, OpenFlow really hasn't taken off. And it's because of a couple of different things. One is that, in essence, that industry has been held hostage to the innovation cycle of one company.
Right.
And that's basically Broadcom, right? So like we're waiting for the next generation of chipsets so you can have scale around OpenFlow and the top rack switches. So the solution set is really kind of morphing out of a necessity. So there is a lot of discussion around white boxes for the underlay. Mm-hmm. So to get cost out, of the capital. There is also, do get the automation piece by doing virtual overlays mm-hmm. On top. Leverage Linux for orchestration and also management and monitoring tools. And then look for standards where you can get them. OpenFlow, I personally think, is an important standard. And I think it's maybe just taking a little bit longer in the enterprise marketplace for it to be implemented in the traditional model where it was on top of rack switches. In the Open vSwitch part and the overlay piece, there seems to be maybe a much more kind of a better path, there. Mm-hmm. But so it's a little bit different, so it's a little bit more broader in terms of solution sets.
Dan, I'd like to address a question towards you. There's been tremendous excitement around SDN and NFV for a number of years, and certainly we've had a lot of different groups participating in the efforts that ONF has had. What do you think has most held back the industry's ability to adopt SDN and NFV?
So I think there have really been a couple of factors. One is simply the availability of equipment that implements it in a flexible way. Second is experience with it. But a third is, I think, organizational inertia. When Nick talks about the reluctance of enterprises to move too quickly in this, part of it is because people fear that their jobs are at risk. And certainly some of them will be. They're used to ways of doing things. They know how things operate. They have cozy relationships with their vendors. And it's unsettling to change those things.
Right.
So we are doing taking a number of steps to try to ease that transition through exposing some successful migration cases and teaching people how to do that, building some tools and metrics for that, enabling coexistence with a lot of the existing investment that these enterprises and service providers have made. And then helping to stimulate the training and educational opportunities that'll help move people's minds.
I think that's an
Could I say
please,
something?
go ahead, Drew.
So I guess you said what is holding SDN and NFV back? So, and I guess Dan gave a very good answer. But at the same time, what I want to say is that remember the following, right? SDN is a disruptive innovation. It is a new paradigm. It will go through its own technology adoption cycle. And we are in Silicon Valley, we have seen many disruptive innovations that go through their own cycle. They start with early adopters, then there is the early majority, then all of that. And so if you look at SDN, nothing is holding SDN back. If you look at early adopters, all the way from Google to NTT Communications to Microsoft to you name it, early adopters are adopting open flow SDN-based technologies, deploying them in their mainstream networks, right? There is no shortage of those examples. So the thing is, it will take time now, and every time there's a disruptive innovation, you know that it has some compelling value proposition that is very good, and there are some limitations. And it takes time for the disruptive innovations to catch up. And that is going to happen. I think there is enough evidence to suggest that that is happening. So I would say nothing is holding SDN back. It is going through a natural adoption cycle, and we are doing pretty well, in fact.
Great. To sort of take a piece of both of those answers, I'd like to direct to the two of you here on the end. Interoperability has come up a couple times in these conversations, right? Guru, you mentioned disruptive innovation, yet certainly a lot of people have said, could we evolve to this disruptive innovation rather than having a revolution and a rip and replace? Can you talk a little bit from the end user perspective, how important is interoperability?
So for us, traditionally as a telco, obviously interoperability is extremely important, being able to work in a multi-vendor and multi-solution environment. From my perspective, we like different types of interoperability. So as you try to bring new solutions into your network, for instance, like if it's like virtualized network functions, you have to make sure that these interoperate with your existing infrastructure, right, with your legacy equipment. The other issue is how you interoperate with other vendors that provide different types of solutions. And the third one is interoperability across different platforms. So you're looking at the cloud, for instance, how it can interoperate with another service provider, right? I mentioned before the virtual network functions infrastructure as a service thing, where I can actually leverage somebody else's equipment and network to offer my end-to-end services. So it's like different forms of interoperability. So what we need to do is essentially focus on those things that we can standardize, whether these are going to be interfaces where I can run different types of applications. For instance, like the northbound interface is one that we may want to think about how we can standardize in a quite agile process. I'm not looking here into a very prolonged process of creating standards around that. So these are kind of things that we think are important from our perspective.
And we'll get back to standards in a second.
Yeah.
But Nick, if you can weigh in, what have you heard in terms of interoperability?
I'll get to that. I want to extrapolate a little bit, maybe what Guru and Dan said, as well. And that what I find in the enterprise marketplace is that it's a very different marketplace. It's not a hyperscale company. It's not delivering one or two applications to hundreds of millions. It's delivering tens of thousands of applications to maybe hundreds of thousands of people. And so there is a much more complex problem set that they're dealing with than the hyperscale companies. They don't have that scale, that leverage in economics, either. So they've been disaggregated as well. So ONUG is providing a way in which they can aggregate and they can basically communicate and through the power of the purse to get the kind of open networking that they want, not what the vendors want. So I think that's really important too, because Dan is right. There is inertia around skill sets and around tree hugging. But it's like whenever they write a job description, they usually start with a CCIE number. And so like they have all the people that think alike. So anyway, I wanted to take that, and now, all right, from the interoperability point of view, is that what's important in here is that there is interoperability between platforms, between the stacks, so that you can mitigate dependence upon vendors, and you can also then accelerate maybe skill set development so that there isn't lock-in. So I think the interoperability piece is extremely important. We really haven't seen it in the industry yet. We really haven't. And so I think if we can start getting towards whether interoperability bake-offs or demonstrations and so forth, that would be great. Like, I don't know if we're talking about a VXLAN interoperability demo, and that's for the overlay. But anyway, it's extremely important to move this industry forward.
Right. So now I do want to come back to Christos' point earlier, which is this is why end users care so much about standards. This is why end users push the developer community to adopt standards. And so I'd like to ask Dan, you've been very much involved in trying to push some standards here in this industry. The first question I have is, how do you think about standards when we're at a time of great brainstorming, where there are so many interesting innovations coming? How do you think about, on one hand, supporting this great innovation, but on the other hand, trying to deliver some of this interoperability?
So one of our mantras at the Open Networking Foundation is to standardize as little as necessary. If standards are chosen at the right place, it really fosters an explosion of innovation around it. I mean, that happened with the Internet Protocol. So we think that the OpenFlow protocol is a great place to standardize, to promote diversity and innovation below in terms of how switches are designed and what kind of technology and what they apply to, and then above in terms of how you can bring enterprise and carrier requirements to bear to configure the network through the blind OpenFlow protocol. We also acknowledge that as you move higher up in the stack and get more into the software world, standards are great, but mostly devised by the community through experience in the field and not by a committee. So we resisted for 2.5 years to even talk about the northbound interfaces. Even though we were urged to standardize one back in 2011, we said that's the wrong idea. If there is a clear need for standards at a software layer, especially when implemented inside a server, that'll be something that can evolve hopefully very quickly through software innovation, especially open source software innovation. And if a standard emerges because it's popular, and especially if it's not controlled by a single vendor, that's the best outcome because it's proven. If an organization like ours or somebody else needs to get involved to help sort things out to make sure that it is open and multi-vendor, then we and others, I'm sure, are willing to do that. The key is to enable those who operate networks to choose the best of breed hardware and software pieces to build their particular network. And that's why interoperability across a common interface can help foster best-of-breed purchasing. Sure.
Christos, you've been involved in the ETSI efforts around this also. Can you speak a little bit about that?
So let me offer my perspective when it comes to SDN and OpenFlow, because we started working with OpenFlow about in 2009, actually, trying to build our first POC around SDN. We used to call this remote control. So one of the challenges that we faced back then is that as we developed that POC, essentially an application running on an SDN controller, it was Knox at that point that was developed by Stanford. And when that was, not available or hasn't been actually updated as we would like to, I had to upgrade to a Floodlight, I think, the one that we used. We found a challenge whether the application that we had developed prior would be still able to run on top of Floodlight. And that requires some fixing as well. So from our perspective, and that's why I mentioned the northbound interface. It's important if you start running applications and you have to move a different platform, a different environment, how do you make sure that there's backwards compatibility? This is very, very important. With respect to NFV, I don't think there's anything really holding us back in terms of this is happening today. We're working on POCs, on proof of concept or capability, if you like. When it comes to NFV, the migration is a bit more stepwise process. It's not as disruptive as in SDN, so you can start, again, embedding these type of solutions in the network, running new NFV-based solutions in parallel with your existing infrastructure. This is sort of like the migration path, so this is already set out.
Sure. Question to both Guru and Dan. In your experience, who sets these standards? How do they get done? Is it end users who sit in a room, talk to each other, and write it up? Are vendors involved? Can you talk a little bit about the process by which we get to standards?
Well, I thought Dan said it pretty well, right? That as soon as you move in the control plane, which is mostly software based, then it is, you build software, you build applications, you get experience. Once we know, we have done that multiple times, we would know what the right APIs are and they become the standards. In the networking world, we have had an obsession with standards. And as networking moves more and more software based, then we have to operate like a software industry. And as a result, I subscribe to the same theory that Dan said, that we should standardize as little as possible, and it should be based on experience, based on real applications. So I think that is how it is. I don't know whether there is a single process like the IETF process or one of the other networking standards processes we have followed. I strongly believe that those are wrong processes as the networking moves more and more software based.
And clearly, we were created by operators and structured in a way that enabled them to sort of drive the standards, what needed to be standardized, based on their requirements. And because OpenFlow is a protocol implemented in hardware in many cases, not in all, but in enough, and it goes across the wire, they felt it was important to make that a standard. And then our structure has a lot. It's an unusual structure. A lot of power is vested in the board of directors, which is all major network operators. We have 8 of them. And they approve everything from the specifications and standards to the working group chairs appointments. But we have many, many vendors participating because you have to be able to match what is needed with what is possible. And so we're kind of a marketplace to bring the producers and the consumers of this technology together to work out solutions that become successful in the market. And we do some standardization, but our real goal is commercial success of the movement.
Now, Nick, let me ask you to build a little bit upon that, maybe taking a slightly different direction. We've talked a lot about standards, and that's certainly very useful. But here, most people here have contributed to open source. Can you talk a little bit from an end user perspective? What is the role of open source? How is open source different, in a sense, from just a standard-setting body?
Yeah, I've been processing the discussion, and I think there's maybe 2 thoughts that go through my head. One is that there are industry standards, de facto standards, and those both can be really useful. I think in our industry right now, I think the work that both Dan and Guru did were extremely helpful because they provided us a way to think differently about networking that we haven't thought of before. Now, whether these particular protocols that were being developed are going to be widely used, who knows? But I think the concepts were powerful. The separation of control and data plan, there's a whole bunch of companies now that are getting value from that. So, and then there's a huge amount of value that comes from the open source communities. Obviously in the Linux world, we've seen massive improvements in terms of the operational efficiencies and the CapEx cost there. And I would hope the same would be true in the networking space, and especially what you guys were doing in OpenDaylight. So I think there is a role for both standards. There's also a role for the concepts that come from those that ignite innovation. But then, frankly, I think the open source pieces of this are going to be more important. And I think the reason I think that is that in the enterprise marketplace, there is a dire need for a software ecosystem in our industry. And this group represents the beginnings of that, and I think that can be extremely powerful. I would love, and I'm sure a lot of the market would really love to see, all of a sudden, all these kind of OpenDaylight applications show up. Okay, maybe it's Yahoo or the folks at JP Morgan, they write this little application on management, and then they open source that. And so there is a growing portfolio or library.
Right.
And hopefully there'll be somebody who's going to be managing the cadence of those things and so forth. But I think that, to me, the open source community is a very powerful one in the computing space, and it will be, I think, very powerful in the networking space as well.
That's great. Christos, do you want to add anything?
I just want to add to that and say that as we move things into software, obviously open source becomes very, very relevant to us. And it's as an example, going back to what you mentioned in your in Keynote was about a university admin that he was trying to solve that problem, right? Mm-hmm. So you can reach out to the open source community and say, hey, this is my problem. Are there any solutions out there, right? And that's why we think that open source is really great, because if I have a problem as Orange or as Deutsche Telekom or as SDN or as Verizon, and might be different, from other carriers, I can reach out to the community and say, who has, a solution to that problem actually, and then I can get the chance to pick the best solution. And I can do that without waiting for a committee to be formed and standardize a solution, So that's what we think the value of open source.
Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to leave 20 minutes for free-form questions from the audience. We have a couple different mics. So if you want to just raise your hand and someone will bring a mic. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. There's a mic right here. So if you want to line up behind the mic that's over here. And we have another one over here on the left, and I guess there's a third one over here on the right.
Or you can come up on the stage and ask your questions.
They could, but...
Give the answers too.
All right.
So question for Dan Pitt. Don't you think the fact that carriers have like $1 trillion worth of sunk investment in existing networking might have something to do with the lack of adoption of OpenFlow? And it's not just a matter of people worrying about their jobs.
So James, I think we're very cognizant of that investment. And so I think some of the carriers have gotten their experience with some greenfield new services that don't affect the investment that they have currently. That's part of the motivation for the cloud service that NTT Communications has offered for almost 2 years now. They try something new, and they learn about it, and then they see how to migrate it into their edge, their aggregation, and their core networks. And definitely, this will take time. As equipment gets replaced in its normal cycle, I think the commercial-grade Ethernet switches are all going to have OpenFlow clients. They may not be turned on right away, but when the network operator is ready, it's easy to do that through remote control. So it's going to be certainly a long road for them, but I think that the competitive forces will be the main accelerator of their adoption.
Could I also
Christos?
say something? Sorry.
Sure, if you would like.
So I guess another thing is your question reminded me of late 80s and early 90s when Lucent or whatever that time it was called used to have the TDM infrastructure. That was also $1 trillion investment, and you know what happened to that $1 trillion investment. It has over a period of time have become all IP, MPLS, and so on. So it's not going to happen overnight, but we know how carriers are hurting, how carriers are not particularly happy about the way things are done today. So over a period of time, you should expect this transition will happen.
Christos, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean, essentially I agree with you. For us, obviously SDN can be kind of disruptive, and it may require some like a forklifting networks. Obviously, this is going to take time to trickle in. So as I said before, if you can identify the pain points in a network and try to bring in SDN solutions to essentially solve these problems and attack any issues, I think that's where I see the benefits, in the short term, rather than just in the long term.
Great. Feel free to stand up, by the way, and come to the mic. I see we have one person over here on the right, but I'd love to see other folks waiting so that we can go from person to person to person.
Quite interactive. This is open source anyway, so you guys.
Exactly. Please, sir.
Hi, guys. I just had a question about standardization and products and assuring that products that are supposedly built to a standard are going to actually interoperate. Conformance testing is one of those ways of assuring that interoperation is going to actually take place in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on conformance testing, the value of conformance testing, and if there is a plan for conformance testing going forward.
Right. Who wants to start?
Nick,
did you want to start?
I could start it. I'm sure everyone will have something to say to it. But no, I totally agree with that. I think performance testing is kind of the first phase in conformance and then interoperability testing. And just to give you an idea, the last ONUG, you had mentioned Srini in your opening remarks on Neela. And Srini and I put together an offering to the industry free of charge. Anyone can come and have their controllers tested. And we would do performance testing. How many controller companies do you think stepped up that one? And it was free. There was no cost to it, right? So how many do you think, stepped up and wanted to have their controllers tested? There were about 10 or so controllers at the time. Anybody? 0. Yeah, that's about right, about 0. So we got Floodlight and Open Contrail were the two. We'll do OpenDaylight. So I think, that is the first step in gaining trust and then moving us to another phase in this evolution.
Dan, you have mentioned that you've got actually a program right now at the ONF to do exactly that, right?
We do. We actually started the other way around. We started with interoperability testing through our Plug Fest, and we have them twice a year in North America. This year, both of them will be mirrored in Beijing, at least. And that has actually helped the vendor. It's helped in a number of ways. It helps us, find some, bugs in the protocol, but it helped a lot of vendors improve their own implementations and then interoperate with controllers. This year, I think it's all OpenFlow 1.3, and we've now started a conformance testing program to, adhere. Do you adhere to the state? Can you trust that this is an OpenFlow implementation? And that's what we're doing first. Conformance to the protocol is no guarantee of interoperability, but non-conformance is almost a guarantee that it won't interoperate. And then the third leg of the stool, which we're rolling out later this year also, is performance benchmarking. Because vendors want to show how well their products perform, and customers want to buy according to some objective criteria.
Makes sense. I'm just going to cut this off here so we can get more questions going. I'll come back to you, sir, starting right over here.
Is there any interest in getting de facto standards or getting a faster adoption of open source at the networking layer? I recently got really excited about an announcement from Cumulus Networks getting Linux on a switch. I don't know how much of a bad word Broadcom is, but is there any excitement there?
I think I get your question. So let me start actually with Christos, which is we heard, one way of getting to a standard, which is a set of people in the room agreeing to one. Are there other ways? Can open source, in a sense, get us to a de facto standard? I think that is the core of his question.
Yeah, I mean, as long as there's coalescing around that from the community can support that, and we can test this in our lab and say, yeah, it suits our purposes. I think we can certainly embrace that. I mean, I don't see any reason why not.
It happens, I think, more in software, and when it happens in the marketplace, it becomes a de facto standard, and that's been very successful. The case the gentleman raised now is a little bit different. Cumulus and Broadcom are both very active in the Open Compute project, which is an open source hardware standard. And the contribution by Cumulus is a Linux operating system distribution with some networking in it. But their main contribution is the Open Network Install Environment, ONI. It allows you to load them or something else. And there are already 3 switching platforms, one from Broadcom, one from Intel, one from Mellanox, for the prototype network switch. So it's a combination of both de facto and committee standards that's happening on the hardware level, and more de facto in the software.
Yeah, and I think if I may add, so I think that is the most important trend that one should watch out, because yes, that is happening to data center today, but it is pretty, the writing is on the wall, as they say. That trend is going to happen in enterprise, service provider, and other parts, just matter of time. So in that sense, the trend is very, very useful and something to watch out is going to happen.
Great, fabulous. Nope, no one there. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Hello, this is Vimal Subha. I have a question for Nick. In your opening comments, you mentioned, folks are looking at SDN and NFV as a way to level off their CapEx and OpEx investment. What advice would you give to organizations when they're adopting, some of these capabilities, and they're looking for an SDN or NFV vendor? Would they use OpEx and CapEx as their first yardstick, or they should look at the outcomes that the vendor can provide, be it agility for enterprise or differentiated services for the service provider market?
Yeah, well, I think what ONUG is also doing is we've been creating use cases and voting on them, and the voting is really based upon everyone who comes to the ONUG conference gets 3 little red dots, and they're supposed to go up to the use cases and vote. And that vote is based upon their likelihood of issuing an RFI or RFQ in the next 12 months. So it provides The prioritization then gives you a propensity to buy and budget development. So then you can kind of look at those use cases, and then you can really see what's important. Like last time we had open branch office networking, L4 through L7 integration, which you can argue whether that's an NFV solution set, and then an open overlay. So, so your question is that what do you sell with first? Do you sell with an economic equation around reduction of capex and opex, or do you sell with a feature equation? And I think you're always going to lose if you sell with a feature, argument. So you have to really sell with what's really the main pain point, and that's really it's capex relief, and more importantly, it's opex automation and reduction of opex. Is really the bottom line. But I don't know. You can provide you some guidance as to like which use cases are most important. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Does anybody else want to weigh in, or are we good?
I just want to make a point which I didn't have the chance to do it earlier. So in my talk, you see, I did not really focus on the capex and opex savings because I think these may vary a lot depending on your situation and your, whether you're like a Verizon, AT&T, or Orange or Deutsche, for instance. So for me, when it comes to NFV, it's more about the agility, the kind of services we can offer, and hopefully, maybe we can come up and create services that before was unimaginable to create and offer to our customers. So that's where I think that's where real value of NFV is. Again, when it comes to capex and opex, obviously there are going to be some savings. We just need to quantify what kind of savings we're going to see. Maybe it's going to be more on the opex side of things. But you have to remember that if we're moving away from dedicated hardware, we have to utilize servers, right, in order to run the same software. And that's going to be a capex, expenditure itself. So, yeah, just a quick point there.
We have someone from this side of the room finally. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bithika Khargaria, and I'm from Extreme Networks. My question was to Dan. So you mentioned that for about 2.5 years, ONF resisted the standardization of northbound interfaces. So I just wanted to understand the reason and the motivation for that, because wouldn't you want to create a platform where application developers, their applications are able to run across multiple different controllers?
Yes, of course. That's the holy grail. But 2.5 years ago, it was not possible. First of all, nobody knew really what a controller should be. There was no experience with them. Nobody knew how far north the northbound interface was, what latitude was it, what's above it, what's below it. And I know that if we had standardized something, we would have gotten it wrong. We would have stifled all the innovation that has since followed. We've got probably 30 controllers have been written, each with its own northbound interface, some explicit and some implicit. And so we really wanted experience to build out the knowledge that would help us later on figure out what is needed. And so we studied it for a year, starting about 1.5 years ago. And we learned how many different ones there were and how different they were. And we built a little map of latitudes and longitudes. The latitudes show the abstraction level of what you're expecting, what's below it to produce. And the longitudes are the different sort of use cases at a given abstraction level. And we are now trying to pick a number of intersection points that represent important market opportunities and try to define the information models that define how the network conveys its capabilities to the applications and how the applications convey their needs to the network. There are very different classifications, actually, of northbound interfaces. For example, in the case of a service provider, the ones that allow the service provider to control services and behavior of the network, and the ones that allow their customers to control that. Those are very different, and for many different kinds of uses of the network. So it's a rich area for investigation. I think there will be ultimately a relatively small number of popular northbound interfaces, but there won't be just the northbound interface.
Question on this one to Guru. Clearly, as a researcher at Stanford, you've been thinking a lot about the northbound side, and certainly OpenStack comes up over and over again. How do you see OpenStack having impact, and how important do you think it is that on the northbound side we have OpenStack integration?
Oh, so I guess OpenStack and SDN, whatever that, yes, there is a synergy. They have to work together, especially in the context of data center, definitely. But I would say the current interface, whatever the Neutron, is relatively a starting point. It does not really exploit all SDN has to offer. It's a very primitive or minimalistic kind of an interface. As we learn more, I expect that that interface will continue to evolve and should continue to evolve, because right now it is really not exploiting all that SDN can offer.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Just a short comment on this, that for those who are really interested in the North, we are going to have a panel right after lunch to discuss that.
Excellent.
Thanks, Uri.
Over here on the right.
Hi, David. One of my concerns about SDN and controllers in general is we're going to follow a same pattern we've seen in network management. In other words, we're going to see vendors essentially have their own private little SDN controller, other than standards. And even with standards, you see vendors picking that, right? How do we keep SDN from fracturing and just re-implementing the same patterns we've seen for network management over the past 10, 15 years? I mean, even on stage, we have at least 2 controllers represented. So how do we get this industry, or this segment of industry, so that we don't just re-implement the same problems?
What a great question. Who wants to tackle that one first?
I have a little story, for that. And what got kind of the L2, L3 interoperability market kind of moving was a guy at MITRE Networks, or MITRE, not MITRE Networks, at MITRE, back east, and he had a couple of $1 million worth of budget to basically buy network switches and routers at the time. And he was like, okay, well, I'm not going to award this until you vendors can basically prove that you can do SNMP interoperable. And it wasn't until that he then started to issue the awards for those budgets. So I think we need something similar for intercontroller interoperability and intercontroller management. And it comes back to the power of the purse, to really kind of force, even if there is a standard there, to kind of force the adoption of it. So I think that's one way that kind of history might repeat itself, and we could evolve into an interoperable, interchangeable kind of SDN world.
Great, thank you.
I guess.
Go ahead.
So I guess
just a short comment, because we're
okay. So I guess I would look at it differently. I think we are at the early stages of SDN in many ways. So in order to say that industry has to unify around a single controller or so on, probably would be a mistake. The innovation will happen when we try out different ideas. There is still so much to be done when we talk about either a controller or distributed network operating system. So much learning to be had that prematurely unifying just to say that industry is all unified probably would be a mistake. Anyway, so that is short
Perfect.
answer.
All right. Unfortunately, we've almost run out of time, so I would like to ask each of you to make a closing statement around one specific topic. Starting with Guru, what I would love to hear from you is, given your perspective, what would you like to see from OpenDaylight? What would you like to see from this community gathered here in front of you?
Okay, so I guess first of all, I want to congratulate the OpenDaylight community, you and others who have been working on it. So this is a major accomplishment, a milestone in the evolution of SDN. So in that sense, I am very gratified to see that something has come together, and so that is great. Open source is very, very important to SDN as well as in general the next generation of computing and networking. Having said all of this, every open source is not successful, every open source is not necessarily accomplishes its mission. So we have to be self-critical when we are doing these large community-based open source projects. And I hope we will be self-critical in trying to understand, are we really trying to bring SDN value proposition through open source to the end customers? Are we trying to use open source to protect the legacy? Are we trying to do incrementalism? Because a lot of times with disruptive innovation, this is all studied by so many people, the incumbents have a tendency to do marginal analysis, marginal cost analysis, and so they are jumping on open source. That is a great idea, but you have to think whether they are bringing that marginal cost analysis, incrementalism, protecting legacy into this particular framework. And so I think that is, and to some extent it is all healthy, but we have to keep our eyes open and be self-critical enough.
Sure. Thank you, Guru. So if I can restate that, you're challenging this group to really embody and be real change and have a big impact. I think we all certainly feel that way. Dan?
I would like to see really two things. I would like to see the different modules in OpenDaylight be truly modular. So if somebody wants to use this one and then that one and come in with some other alternative, it is really kind of a plug and play model. And I would like to see the southbound interface efforts not confuse things or spend too much time supporting sort of equivalent southbound protocols to OpenFlow that really don't add anything to it, and that are not programmatic, like SNMP is not programmatic. So concentrate on where you can really add value and take advantage of what other people are doing that can accelerate your efforts.
Okay. Nick?
An app store. I think it'd be great to see applications being written on top of OpenDaylight that are useful and effective, and that can be downloaded and used, whether they're on Cumulus white boxes or Pika 8 white boxes or other controllers out there.
So you're speaking to modularity again, to some extent. All right, great.
Yeah, from my perspective, I'll just pass on the message that NFV is happening today and extend the call and invitation to the industry to participate, whether like a startup or an incumbent vendor, to embrace open source and contribute. If you have solutions that can help us make more money, we can help you back monetize your solutions.
Fabulous. If you can all please join me in thanking these four illustrious panelists. Thank you. By addressing a question to you, Nick. As you run the Open Networking User Group, I imagine that you have a lot of different users across a lot of different industries talk to you about the challenges of running a network. And so I would love to hear you, if you can be, to use a French term, the porte-parole, if you can give voice to the end user sentiments about what's wrong with networking the way it is now.
Okay, yeah, great. Thanks, Neela. Yeah, I think the thing that I often hear is that networking, the marketplace is looking for CapEx and OpEx relief. And let me maybe put that into context. We know that in the hyperscale companies, you might have one engineer that manages 10,000 servers. In enterprise networking, one network engineer may manage, how many would you guess? How many networking devices? Go ahead, you can guess.
60.
50.
60, 50. It's about 120, so it's not that bad. So it's orders of magnitude worse. So there is a huge bloat in terms of the operational cost and expense to manage corporate networks. And now you layer on top of that the two major new trends in computing, both mobile and cloud computing, which are now being forced to contort themselves to a 25-year-old network infrastructure. That also adds a lot of complexity and a lack of flexibility.
Want to add this service, the vendor says, well, maybe yes, maybe no, but if it's yes, it takes 2 years. And then all of the service providers' competitors get to use the feature as well. So it's service introduction that motivates a lot of our members also.
Perfect. So with that, unless Christos, you feel like adding to what you've already said.
Yeah, so we have a different set of challenges actually, looking from the operational side of things. So for us as a service provider, we have to deal with lots of heterogeneous networks in our infrastructure today, lots of legacy equipment. As I mentioned before, technology ages as like dogs, right? They age pretty fast, and how you essentially deal with that situation. And the other thing that is, I cannot move resources around as I need those. So for instance, if there's like a traffic spike somewhere in my network, an unforeseen situation, I want to move dynamically resources and deal with that situation. It's very hard to do it today. So how I can better innovate and essentially, throw resources where I need them, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for us.
That makes sense. Now I'd like to address a question towards you, Guru.
Sure.
So we've talked a little bit about the problem, and I think they've echoed a lot of things that we've been hearing all morning. Now, I know a bunch of folks at Stanford have been thinking for the last 10, 15 years about what an ideal solution would be. How might we do things completely differently than we do it now? So I thought maybe you could share a little bit about your thoughts on the matter.
Because I guess there is a technical aspect to the solution, and there is the industry structure.
The OpenFlow substrate, and also new technologies underneath it that it applies to. So we've been a supporter of the open movement in general. This is one component of it, and I'm excited to be here today.
Great, thank you. Guru.
Hi, I'm Guru Parulkar. Good morning. I serve as the Executive Director of Open Networking Research Center at Stanford University, also Executive Director of Open Networking Lab, which is an independent nonprofit organization, and I also run something called Open Networking Summit. So as you probably know, SDN started at Stanford, so we have been involved in SDN from very beginning. Our motivation has always been to enable innovation, help network operators build their infrastructure with better CapEx, better OpEx, be able to bring new services. And in support of that, we are still working to make that happen. We still have long ways to go, but that has been, we have been after for all these years.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So let me share a little bit with you about why I asked these four gentlemen to join us here. As I began in my keynote, I talked about how we all have a shared common vision that something needs to change within the network. And that's shared in our community certainly by the developers, but also it comes from a groundswell of feelings that we have heard from end users. And so each of these individuals is representing a group of users. And so I wanted to start. The way we're going to run this is I'm going to ask each individual to introduce themselves, to talk a little bit about who they are, what they do. Christos, I think everybody knows you at this point.
Yeah, so I haven't really changed the last couple of hours, so I'm the same person. I'm working out of our office in San Francisco with the Orange, so you know, being
perfect
research scientist there.
Nick.
I'm Nick Lippis, and I'm a co-founder and also a co-chair of the Open Networking User Group, which is a user group that is primarily on the East Coast right now, and we're very fortunate to have most of our board members are members of the large financial services, so like JP Morgan, UBS, Credit Suisse, let's see, Citigroup, as well as Sears, The Gap, FedEx, Equinox, and so forth. So we run a large user group that's focused around open networking and open infrastructure.
Great. Dan?
Well, good morning. My name is Dan Pitt. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Networking Foundation. We are approaching our third anniversary next month. We are dedicated to the acceleration of the adoption of Open SDN. We formed really out of the work that came from Stanford University. We built out what we call the OpenFlow substrate. We standardized the OpenFlow protocol. We have built lots of hooks and tools to the orchestration and software layers above the
flexibility. Then you layer on top of that big data that's trying to be pulled out of the network, as well as the Internet of Things, which allegedly we're going to go from like billions to trillions of devices. And so without a new operational model to how we build and manage networks, it's just not going to happen. Or it's just going to be the operational cost is just going to run itself into limiting what they might be able to do. So I think that's what we often hear a lot. And the answer really comes down to a lot of automation around configuration and being able to drive things down from the application.
Well, we'll get to the solution in a second. Sure, Dan, did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, just briefly. We have several dozen major service providers, telecom service providers, and major enterprises that are members of and active in ONF. And in addition to the CapEx and OpEx savings that Nick mentioned, they've also come to us because they want to increase the velocity by which they can create and add new services to be competitive as their businesses change from being bit carriers to software and service providers. Part of it is motivated by the desire to compete with some of the over-the-tops. But for a long time, they've felt that they can conceive new services, but they can't implement them very fast, and especially without the cooperation of the vendors who kind of hold the purse strings, and in particular, without being able to be unique in them. Because if they go to a vendor and say, I